Well, good morning to you and welcome to the Vicarage here at Penn. Lovely to see you and thank you for joining us today. Hope you had a lovely weekend. We had another really good weekend at church. Just to say about a notice which I announced this weekend. As from the 7th of March and for 6 months, I'm going to be leading 2 parishes, it would appear. I'm still the Vicar of Penn. I'm still living in Penn. I'll be the Vicar of Penn. But for 6 months, the Bishop of Wolverhampton has asked me to do a secondment to the parish of St Editha's in Tamworth. So I'm going to be leading 2 large churches at the same time. God willing, preparing the way for hopefully they'll get a full-time vicar later in the year or something like that. So that's what I'll be doing. To reassure you, I'm not moving house, and the Bible talks are still going to continue while I'm doing this. Hopefully some of the Tamworth people might join us for them as well. But anyway, let you know, I'm not leaving Penn, but I'm going to be for 6 months leading 2 parishes at once. I think the bishop thinks I haven't got enough to do. Anyway, without further ado, we are working our way through the Gospel of Matthew, and we start on chapter 11 today. Just to remind you what's happened, Jesus in chapters 5, 6 and 7 had given his famous Sermon on the Mount. Then he'd done some miracles, demonstrating that he's the Messiah and so on. Then he saw the crowds, so he picked 12 disciples and he sent them out and he gave them some warnings and some challenges about some of the things that they might encounter. But in chapter 11 and 12, we start to see some of these, shall we say, some of these challenges face to face. And the first one he encounters this morning is somebody who experiences what's called a crisis of faith. And it's worth seeing these challenges actually because there's some of the kinds of things that people encounter today. And as I say, in the first part of chapter 11, we have somebody who encounters what we'd nowadays call doubts or some kind of crisis of faith. And it comes from a most unexpected source. So without further ado, I shall read you Matthew chapter 11. I'm going to read you verses 1 to 15. Now when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and proclaim his message in their cities. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to them, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offence at me." As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go to see? A prophet. Yes, I tell you, I'm much more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it's written, 'See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John came, and if you're willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who is to come. Let anyone with ears listen." And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, as I said, one of the issues which people encounter in their Christian faith is what you might call times of doubt, or when it comes extreme, is what you might call a crisis of faith. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all have them at some point in our lives, sometimes lots of the time, but it's something we all experience in our life. John the Baptist has been in prisons from the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and for whatever reason, he sends a message through his disciples to Jesus. Are you the one? Are you the main man, or are we to expect another one? In other words, he's kind of, he's saying to Jesus, are you really the one? That's kind of where he's coming from. So as you can see, he is struggling with doubts here. Now, it could be, I'm speculating now, all sorts of reasons why John might have had this kind of crisis of faith. And these are things that we can all experience in our lives today. Firstly, he's been in prison. He's been isolated, an experience that many people feel, and probably for a good year or so, something like that. So while it's all been going on outside, John has been isolated in prison without, I was ventured to suggest, a great deal of kind of godly company to keep him company, to encourage him while he's doing it. So he's been in prison, and probably for quite a long time. Secondly, while he'd been in prison, of course, he hadn't seen the miracles. Everybody else had seen the great things that Jesus had done. Other people had seen Jesus still the storm and heal people with leprosy and all that type of stuff. John, of course, had been in prison. So everybody else had seen it, But of course, he hadn't seen it. He hadn't actually been witness to all these amazing things that are going on. John may have heard about them, but John hadn't actually seen them for himself like everybody else had. Thirdly, it could be that being in prison and being in prison for a long time, he may well have encountered some mental issues, some sort of depression or something like that. And it's amazing how many people do struggle with depression. And dare I say, having spent a long time in prison, that kind of ongoing would have got to him. I think it's a bit like many of us feel with the COVID thing. In the early months, for some of us, there was almost a kind of sense of adrenaline was flying. If we were in crisis management, but to keep it going for nearly 2 years now, the sense of the grinding continue and that kind of thing. And it may well be, possibly suggested speculatively, that John may have encountered some kind of depression in prison too. It could also have been feeling that he was out of it. Early when he'd been preaching and when he'd been baptizing Jesus or something, he'd been right kind of in the middle of it. He was the person out in the desert. It was all very exciting. It was challenging, of course, and all that sort of stuff. But there had been a time when he'd been at the centre of things. But as he always said would happen, he had handed the baton over to Jesus. And this wasn't because he'd done it badly. Actually, what it means is he'd done his job really well. He'd fulfilled his purpose, He'd done his job. He'd handed over to Jesus. But the point is now, he had been at the centre and he wasn't at the centre of things anymore. And he may have been feeling somewhat out of it, you might feel post-retirement not being part of things anymore. He might have felt kind of out of it in that respect as well, possibly. And another possibility could be that he knew Jesus was the main man, but he might like other people have some of the idea that Jesus was going to come along and cast out all the evil and kick out the Romans, and he may have had some of that. He may have had a slightly incorrect idea about what the Messiah was. I mean, he knew Jesus was the main man, but he might not necessarily have had a full idea what was really going on. So for all manner of reasons, and it could be other reasons, John is languishing in prison. And he has this kind of crisis of faith. And as I say, these are feelings that, many of us feel. We often feel, a bit kind of isolated. Sometimes we can feel a bit out of it. Sometimes we can experience depression, things in our lives, grinding things going on and on and on. We can feel out of it. We go through misunderstandings. And all sorts of things can bring us to points of doubt. And an extreme version is a kind of crisis of faith. And I get the impression that John the Baptizer has one here. Now, what is Jesus' response is very interesting. Firstly, he reminds us that John the Baptist was a seriously great man. I mean, you have to remember, this is the guy that was out in the desert, who, despite being in the desert, people still came to see him. That he was the new Elijah. I mean, John the Baptist was a seriously great guy. He was holy, he was radical, he was profound, he was wise, he spoke truth to power, he was incredibly brave, as well as being one of Jesus' cousins himself. I mean, Jesus puts it so strong that no one has been born of woman greater than John the Baptist. I mean, John the Baptist, as I say, was a seriously great guy. And I suppose what it tells us is that even great people like John the Baptist, who put their life on the line, go through times of doubt too. And actually, I think we all do too. So when we experience crisis of faith, then bear in mind that we're in good company, because John the Baptist did too. And I think it's worth remembering that even great people like John the Baptist, and you hear all sorts of stories about great men and women of faith of history who encountered huge amounts of doubt in their lives as well. So, in a sense, when we experience crises and when we experience doubt, bear in mind we're in good company too. But what in the end did Jesus do? I mean, there isn't an easy cure to crisis of faith. If there was, I wish I knew it. But what does Jesus do here is he points out to John, tells John's disciples to go back and tell John. He points out some of the things that are going on, that the eyes of the blind are being opened, and the ears of the deaf are unstopped, and that lame people are walking, and that even more importantly, the gospel of Jesus Christ is the gospel, the good news, is being preached to the poor. And that is what true Messiahship is all about. So in a sense, he resets John's understanding about the Messiah is. The Messiah is someone who's going to preach the good news to the poor and show these signs that were predicted in the books like Isaiah in the Old Testament. So he points out what true Messiahship is, and that Jesus is doing things that the true Messiah does. So he kind of corrects him and puts him straight with truth. But I think, and I think this is the one for me that helps me in my faith more than anything. My spiritual director asked me a few months ago, what encourages me most in my faith? And me, it's, I love the Bible, I love worship and everything else. But I think the thing that encourages me most is when I can see God at work in the world today. When I can interpret and see God's work, God at hand. It reminds me, in a sense, that God has got it, that God is in command, that God knows what he's doing, that God's alive, that God's not given up on us, that God's at work in his world. And when I look back at things that happened even here, the way I was called here, some of the things that have happened here in the last few years, things around the choir and so on, great things that God has done through it, it kind of reminds me that God's at work in my world, in the world. So I think the greatest, to me, encouragement in my faith is to remind myself of things that God has done in my life and in the world, and that God is doing in my life and in the world. And that, to me, is what encourages me most in my faith. So, here we have one of the challenges of what we encounter in our Christian journey, which is one of doubt and crises of faith, which we all encounter sometimes. And it can come for all sorts of reasons. So be on the lookout for them when they happen. Remember that they can happen to great people. So if they happen to you, then you're in good company too. But try and look for times in your life when God's done good things. Try and remember those times when God's been at work in your life. And then encourage, because they encourage me, they clearly encourage John, and they'll encourage you too. Hope that makes sense. More tomorrow. God bless you.